So let me just introduce Ninan, my esteemed pleasure to do so. He is the Associate Dean, Equity and Diversity at the UBC Faculty of Science. He's a professor in the Department of Microbiology and Immunology and the Department of Zoology. He started at UBC in 2003, and his current research focuses on cytokine control of immune cells, with a specific interest in airway immunity. So if you've got more questions about that, please ask him, because I can't say much more than that. In his role as Associate Dean, he has responsibility for equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives, including the oversight of faculty recruitment processes, faculty data analysis, and reporting on EDI progress for the Faculty of Science. He has been interviewed by the Globe and Mail. He's advised CIHR, NSERC, Genome Canada, and NRC policymakers on best practices. He serves on the UBC President's Anti-Racism and Inclusive Excellence Task Force. He's a member of the Race and Leadership Committee, and he is the Director of EDI for the COVID Variant Research Network in Canada. I can say that while I was scanning the web to look for information to pull together the bio, I came upon Rate My Professor, and I can tell you that overwhelmingly he is ranked as awesome. And besides the few comments about his messy writing, he is described as passionate, energetic, enthusiastic, caring, and very approachable. And I think you're going to get firsthand experience of that today. So thanks, Ninan, for joining us, and I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Shirley. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. I'm just going to get my screen launched. Let's go to full screen and desktop 2. Are you seeing just the blue screen? Perfect. Okay. Make sure my controls are the way I'd like it. Okay. Thank you so much for that. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm an immigrant settler in the traditional ancestral unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. Colonialism is not an abstraction for my family, as I'll show you in the next slide where my roots are. And both my grandparents and parents lived through both the British Empire in India, which is where my original roots are, and in Malaya, where I was born. And I bring this up because I've encountered the viewpoint that colonialism is an abstraction that Canadians don't understand and don't relate to. And that's fundamentally an obstacle that we have to overcome if we're really going to make progress in this, in everything that we're trying to do, both in the academy and beyond. Okay, so let me just tell you a little bit about my story. So as I alluded to, my ancestral roots are in Southwest India, the southwesternmost state, Kerala, distinguished only by the fact that it has the highest percentage of Christians, which is my original community, and also the highest literacy rate in all the states of India. So it's like 94% literacy rate in India. And so my grandparents and my parents, were shuttled between Southeast Asia and India. So of my immediate family, only my brother and I, the second and third kids, were born outside of India. So my parents and my older sister were born in India. So I was born in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur. That's my birthplace. And at the age of 7, we moved to Singapore, which is where I grew up and where I was raised. And, this is, I'm a person who's a visible minority here in Canada, but I was a minority in Singapore and Malaysia as well. And so that experience is really foundational to how I grew up and my worldview. So I did my, training in Singapore. I grew up there, got through to high school, which is called junior college, which is the grade 11 and 12 training that we get. And then I got into first year university at National University of Singapore. It was about that time that I realized that I really was interested in something called molecular biology. It was a new area of biology that was very hot. And Singapore at that time, National University of Singapore, contrast to today, did not have anything like that. And my parents were supportive enough to say, if you wanted to go overseas, we'll do what we can to support you. And so I cast about and essentially applied as a transfer student to get into second year. And I applied to 3 universities in Canada, Dalhousie being one of them, Toronto being another, and I can't remember the third one. Could have been UBC, could have been McGill, but only Dalhousie accepted my transfer credits from National University of Singapore. So it's an irony because National University of Singapore now is ranked higher than any of those 3 universities, right? And so I ended up at Dalhousie, did my undergraduate there, and then I moved to McGill, did my master's there, and then I did my PhD in University of Ottawa. And then I ended up doing a postdoctoral fellowship in University of California, San Francisco in the Gladstone Institutes. And, shortly after 9/11 happened, my boss shuttered the lab. I was a senior postdoc and propelled me into the workplace, into the job market. And I was lucky, the first place I applied to, which was UBC Microbiology and Immunology and Zoology, was the place I landed an offer. So in 2003, I started my position in UBC. So fast forward, this is the tiny island of Singapore, which is where my origin story is. And so that's it in short. It's this. This is where I grew up. My bachelor's in Dalhousie, master's in McGill, PhD in Ottawa, postdoctoral fellowship at Gladstone Institutes, and then I became an assistant professor at UBC MNI in zoology. Got tenure years ago. Became full professor about, I think, 6 years ago. And 3.5 years ago, the then Dean of Science, actually the Associate Dean, invited me to an event. And on the way back, it was where I first encountered the equity myth authors, Melinda Smith and Ina Dua, among others, hosted by Minal Matani. And on the walk back, my mind was blown. And my colleague, Vanessa Auld, who's now head of zoology, but my predecessor as Associate Dean, said, "So how about it?" And I said, "How about what?" She said, "How about you become Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion?" And my first reaction was no, but I did manage to get talked into it by the previous dean. So that's what I've been doing for the last 3.5 years. So just briefly as a segue, I am a research scientist by training. That's what I still do that. I have 2 Tri-Council grants. My lab interest is really on this class of immune regulators called cytokines. If you think of them as immune hormones, you'd be about right. And cytokines have a broad range of roles in ensuring your immune system develops properly, but also in shaping the type of immune response you get. And so we've focused in these days on airway immunity. We've been doing this for about 10 years now. And so there's 2 arms. One is responses to viral infections. So influenza is what we work on. I don't do COVID research. We applied, we didn't get the funding. But fundamentally, when a virus infects your lung, it induces damage. And how you respond to that damage is really vital for good outcomes. And so repair after viral infection is one arm of the immune response. So immune cells don't just clear a viral infection, but they're also responsible for making sure it's done in a way that allows for proper healing. And that's what we're hearing. People who have long COVID essentially have lungs that are so damaged they're getting long-term damage, which is called fibrosis. And so that tipping point is shaped by cytokines. And I'm interested in that with respect to influenza. The other thing that we're active in working on is how the immune system interacts with lung tumors, which is a big part of cancer response. And we now have a novel class of immunotherapeutics, won a Nobel Prize about 3 years ago, Nobel Prize for Medicine. And my lab studies immune cells that are responsible for trying to clear those lung cancers. Okay, so that's active in my lab. I've got 4 graduate students right now, and that keeps me active in the research front. I say that because it is one of the biggest ways in which I have credibility with faculty. Faculty are notoriously skeptical, right? That's the nature of scientific faculty. You're taught to be skeptics about facts. And so the fact that I'm a scientist myself has a lot allows me a lot of leeway in encountering some of that skepticism, because I am seen as one of them, which is a benefit and a privilege that I don't take lightly. All right, so this is my role as Associate Dean. We've been really focused on the issues of diversity in the Faculty of Science. We want to understand what the barriers are. We want to increase support for women, visible or racialized graduate students and other groups of students, postdocs, as well as faculty members. All right, so staff are not included on here, and it's certainly something that we know. So in different dean's offices have different structures, and so whether things are siloed is something that we should think about. But students, staff, and faculty are in 3 different silos, and so working across those artificial barriers is something that we want to think about, and I think we've been doing that effectively in some respects. One of the key things we've really done is to make sure the processes such as hiring and promotion are as equitable as possible. So all of this rests on one policy, UBC policy HR 10, which keeps us aligned with the federal laws, the Employment Equity Act, and with BC Human Rights Act. Okay, and then we want to have conversations, and I have, because my predecessor did it, I now do this training of faculty about forms of biases, particularly when it comes to hiring of faculty. Okay, so I'm going to show you a little bit about what we've done there. So I'll tell you that in the past, our main focus was on gender equity. So my predecessors really moved the needle on this, and I think we've been making progress on it. And when I came in, it became clear to me that other aspects of equity and inclusion for other underrepresented groups needed to be elevated. I had my own lived experience, which informed that view. And so people who identify as visible minorities, or the term that's used, racialized minorities, is more accurate. Individuals who are 2S LGBTQ+, individuals who are Indigenous, and people with disabilities. So these are the 5, including women, the 5 recognized equity deserving groups or underrepresented groups. And so when I started in 2003, I'm focusing on one of my 2 departments, microbiology and immunology. This was the total professoriate in 03, right? So this is the female faculty, including education leaders, and this was the male faculty, right? So you can see, skewed by gender, and if you haven't noticed, also skewed by racial diversity, all right? When I arrived, there were, including me, 3 racialized faculty, which actually I can't even disclose those numbers because it's less than the number that allows us to disclose under privacy rules. But when you restrict it to just research faculty, because many STEM faculties have great diversity when they include education leadership, which tends to be female dominated, you are sort of, making it look better than it really is. When you restrict it to research faculty, you can see that this is appallingly poor gender diversity, right? For women in the health and biological sciences, in the postdoc stage are 50% of our postdocs. And so for us to only have 14% of our research faculty be female is an appalling statistic. So that was the way it was in 2003. So fast forward to 2021, this is when I became, well, it's this year, but I was by this point full professor for a few years. We had made some strides. Gender diversity has risen to, it's now 38%, and this has dropped to 62% male. But again, if you look at research faculty, it's still only 31%. This is still below the 50% mark, which is our benchmark. All right. And so we've got some ways to go yet. And what I also want to point out to you, that we're focusing on gender diversity. When you look intersectionally, when you look at racial diversity, we had actually gone down until 6 months ago. We had lost one of our senior faculty who was racialized, and only last June was when we hired a new woman of color, who was the first person who was racialized to be hired since I was 18 years ago. So at that hiring rate, if that's all we recruit, is every 18 years we recruit one more racialized person, we are never going to come close to matching our student diversity, our candidate pool diversity, our student diversity, let alone the diversity of our general population in the Lower Mainland. So this is the kind of metrics I do. This is a breakdown of gender diversity for science as a whole. I'll describe the graphs in a second, but every individual unit is shown here. This is available on our biennial report. And what I'm going to show you is the blue bar is basically our reference standard. It's basically the US National Science Foundation gender diversity. So the available pool, we're using the US NSF as a surrogate for an available pool that is our reference standard. And so you can see the individual units or faculty as a whole are shown in gray or orange. And it's in orange if it's statistically divergent from the available pool that is significant. All right, so you can see science as a whole is statistically divergent from the available pool by about 10 percentage points. The difference is shown here. So take the difference between the who's here and the available pool, and you subtract it. If it's to the left of the 0 mark, it means it's a deficit. Okay, so science is in deficit, and that's a significant deficit for gender diversity. And what you'll see is this is our newest data from 2020. In the past, we used to have about 3 units that were in orange, and fast forward to 2020, we actually only have 1 unit that's significantly divergent from its available pool. So that's not bad. We have no departments that have 0 women, and no departments where the number of women is so low we have to suppress the numbers. Okay, so that is progress, and it's great. All right. When we did this analysis with racialized faculty, again using self-disclosure as the gold standard for identifying who sees themselves as racialized, you'll see that the picture is way worse. Science as a whole is significantly divergent from the reference pool. This time we're using a different standard. The US is not a good marker because it's a different definition for visible minorities there. So we're using the most proximate marker we have, which is the average of the last 9 years of people who have applied. That's a deficit of 15 percentage points from the available pool. Individual units are shown here. And what you can see is that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units where the racial diversity is significantly divergent from the available pool. All right. And in fact, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, and there's a 5th where the numbers are so low, we have to suppress the numbers because there's no critical mass of racialized individuals and we can't invade their privacy by disclosing those numbers. Okay, so what that means is that when you look at the distribution of the deficit, what you will notice is that for racial diversity, there are far more units to the left of the bar than there are to the right of the bar. This is not a random distribution. So when scientists tell themselves that merit is the sole basis on which they recruit people, this data suggests otherwise, because if it was truly just merit, you would expect it to be a random distribution, just like we saw for women. We do not see a random distribution here. And what that says is that we have had systematic bias with respect to racialized faculty recruitment. So we've explored how that looks like, and we know that gatekeeping at search committee processes is the #1 place where we see a difference between racialized candidate recruitment and that for hiring of women. Okay, so I won't get into all of that, but that's the kind of data that we've shown that helps move the needle in changing the conversation and getting people to understand that this is us. I'm just going to touch on the differential in the existing faculty diversity with the available candidate pool for the 3 other equity deserving groups, just to make sure that you hear that we cover all 5 equity deserving groups. People with disabilities make up only about 1.5 to 2% of our research faculty, and the deficit is seen to be low. It's seen to be single-digit deficits, all right, because our available pool is apparently low. We know that people with disabilities are probably the one group that we are probably underestimating the diversity gap on, because the labor market assessment says it's actually about 5 to 6% of the available pool. But the studies that I've seen from the EIO, Haley Branch is a former intern at the EIO who has done a brilliant talk where she has data that suggests that in general society, with including hidden disabilities, it could be as high as 30 to 35% of people have a form of disability or another. And when you study academia, when you look at undergraduates, you see a diminishment of the percentage of people who self-declare people with a disability. That means either they are excluded from the pipeline, and this goes all the way, drops to 20% in undergrads, drops to 12% in graduate school, drops to about 9% in assistant profs, and it's down to 4% in full professors. That's data I don't have. It's data from Haley Branch. And what that suggests is we either have stigmatized disability, so people no longer declare it, or academia is so unfriendly to people with disability that they leave the system. All right, so this might be an underestimate. Indigenous or Aboriginal faculty are in single digits as well in the representation. So we have now just crossed from the number suppressed to declaring that it's less than 1%. And the available pool is small as well in the 1 to 2% range. So our deficit looks small, but we know the general population is about 5%. And so that is something that we have to address. Our 2S LGBTQ plus individuals are well represented in both the research and the education leadership. So we have single digit above 0 or double digit above 0 with respect to education leaders. So this is an example of a equity deserving group that has great diversity, but in stories that we've heard continue to feel in exclusion and siloed experiences, which is something that raises the fact that equity and inclusion is more than just getting representation. It's more than just having diversity and the snapshot of a faculty that looks representative. You have to create a climate where they're also included in terms of things like decision-making and their lived experience. So a key take-home message is individual bias is not the only place where we focus on. We really talk about structural and institutional bias. So institutional bias is really a system of hierarchy and inequity, primarily characterized by the preferential treatment, privilege, and power for the majority group at the expense of minority groups. Okay, so that is what structural bias is. And we cannot fix the system by just focusing on implicit bias, which is what is highly favored in a lot of corporate training. It is certainly clear that individual biases exist and they are factors, but you will not change a system by just focusing on individual bias. You have to focus on structural bias as well. Okay, and structural bias exists throughout society. We see that in graduation rates. We see that in prison rates for some communities. We see that in dying in police custody. And we see that in dying of COVID, which is the most recent example that woke our governments up to the reality for minoritized people. So I like to train our faculty that, you know, much as they see themselves as scientists who are trained at the scientific method and they're strictly metrics driven. This is a study from a cultural anthropologist, Sharon Troweek, who studied particle physicists and basically documented that scientists have tribal behavior. We have rites of passage, we have sanctions for nonconformity, we have intense hierarchies, and we're certainly not above cultural norms. And so this is part of what it takes for us to understand that we have to move beyond that. And so this is my goal, you know, rough estimate for when I might, you know, retire or start thinking about transitioning to another career is, you know, by this stage, I would love to see both my departments not only be gender diverse, but to be intersectionally so in terms of the range of gender identities, including non-binary individuals, and being intersectionally diverse for both race, gender, LGBTQ status, peoples with disabilities, and Indigenous colleagues. Okay, and just to quickly, 2 sentences about my role in COVARNet, which is the national network, COVID variant research network. I'm the director for EDI there. And so this is the quote from our director. This just got created about 8 months ago. The network will act as Canada's integrated platform for determining how variants of concern, which are variant viruses of COVID, impact Canadians from diverse communities and demographics to track how this virus is mutating in real time while evolving into a future cornerstone for pandemic preparedness in Canada. Our governments woke up to the reality that we don't actually systematically collect, disaggregate racial data. And yet it became really clear as the pandemic evolved that different people experience this virus very differently. So this is standard Stats Canada data from their website, looking at mortality. This is death per 100,000 people. And we're looking at communities across the country. So this is not just Ontario, but Ontario had the first data showing that neighborhoods that were disproportionately high for racialized people had the highest mortality in total, but as well as by sex. So both males and females from communities that had greater than 25% racialized minorities had the highest mortality rates. And there are many reasons behind this, including the ways in which their roles in society are racialized, the sorts of jobs that are open to these individuals, the number of buses they have to take, the delay in provincial authorities instituting safety practices in public transit, the fact that bus drivers had to take 3 days to request days off when they had symptoms, which meant they were infecting individuals. This was a failure of the system that does not recognize the way in which race and sex and other identities can play into inequities in responding to a pandemic. And so most provincial health authorities actually don't collect disaggregated demographic data. Manitoba is the only one. This is neighborhood level analyses, which is really crude analyses, right? And so we cannot answer this question fundamentally, is the Black community or the Filipino community or the East Asian community differentially affected by COVID, because we don't collect that data. And so BC is introducing a data law update in order to make that requirement in law, which would change how the province operates. But I'll stop there now and free up the time for doing what we need to do.
Thanks so much, Ninan. I think we should have slotted you for a couple of these hot lunches because there's so much that you're involved in and that so much that is relevant for all of us today. We're going to take a little bit of a break just so that you can gather your thoughts and plug your questions into the Slido app. And then come back and we've got some questions that were submitted upon registration, as well as I see some questions being populated in Slido as well. So maybe 3 to 4 minutes and we'll be back. And then we'll put Ninan on the hotspot for questions. All right, should we slowly come back? Because there's some questions that we'd like to get to. And please keep populating the Slido, but I'm going to start with some of the questions that were sent to us upon registration. So Ninan, the question is, what are you passionate about doing on EDI for the Faculty of Science and in the liaising that you do with UBC EIO office and other EDI leaders?
Well, I mean, people who know me know that I, as the student said in Rate My Professor, I get passionate about what I do. And I think moving the needle, shifting the culture has been the biggest priority for what I set out to do. You know, I just started by asking simple questions about what did we have in terms of data on my department. And then once I saw one department, I thought, well, what about the other departments? And just within 6 months, we had a snapshot of what was going on and became clear that the racial inequity was completely hidden. And I didn't go into it. I mean, I'm a racialized minority. I knew that was going to be important to me, but I didn't know how important it was going to become. And I'll tell you that I'm the first racialized person to serve on the dean's office, and not the last. So we have a second colleague who's racialized, assistant dean. But no women of color faculty have served in the dean's office yet. And so when I started, I didn't want to make race the thing because I would then be labeled. And so I was hesitant to bring it up. It took a good while. And once I saw data and once it became incontrovertible, I started the conversations, and the receptivity was fantastic. And then I certainly can tell you in the last 2 summers, once the terrible murder of George Floyd and the uncovering of the Indigenous children's unmarked graves, the conversation has reached a fever pitch, and that made it much more easy for us to bring up the issues. It's always been there, and I will say I've been working on it for 3.5 years. And by talking about it, the word got out. I mean, Faculty of Arts asked me to present this work, and then it took off like a wildfire. I presented this work to Faculty Equity Leads, my other colleagues. The president asked me to speak to the leadership convention, the President's Leadership Conference last fall. So I'm really excited by the fact the conversation has happened, and we are now in a position where we can actually shift the needle, where the culture shifts. Because the last thing I want to do is to step out of my role, when my term is done, and for things to go back the way it was. Then it means that it was only driven by an individual, and that cannot be how it is. It's got to be that even in my absence, things will continue because we've understood how wrong it is to continue the way it was.
And appreciating that you're seeing changes and more conversations about this and sort of this fever pitch. Are there challenges, and what are they in promoting EDI in the Faculty of Science or in the broader UBC community?
There's a term that's called equity diversion, right? And it is that we are in this position not because it's not an accident. And we have to understand what systemic biases are. Systemic biases are the system has set it up so that it would be this way. And so when individuals who have the lived experience who try to switch the culture, what you often will encounter is a push to reset the way things were. To resist that. And equity diversion takes many forms. It can be, the system can't collect data on race or disaggregate data. It's not something we do. We've never done this before. So it is often, and many of you will be in those ranks and will be privy to hearing these conversations. And you are now in the position to resist and to call it out when that happens, right? Because that's a system essentially staying to the true and narrow because that's what it knows. That's what it has been doing for 100 years. UBC has been around for 100 years, right? And so that is, in essence, what the dominant group will do. And so being aware of that is the first step. But awareness is not enough. It takes positive action. The Employment Equity Act and Policy HR 10 is a positive requirement. It's not a passive requirement. You actually have to take steps to positively shift the needle with respect to hiring specifically. And so that is, one of the bars. You never know when you're going to encounter it. And when you encounter it, it can be very disconcerting. And when you are in affinity groups, you will hear it voiced at length how there's resistance to change, and that's called equity diverting, and that's a term that I have used and other people have described.
And noting that the presentation and a lot of your slides and the work that you're doing is focused on faculty, you're speaking to an audience of mostly staff here. What can you say about the work that's being done for promoting recruitment and retention of racialized and other minority marginalized groups of staff?
To be honest, it's not in my portfolio to cover staff. We probably have the workplace experience survey that my colleague who's on this call and I look over very closely. It's every other year, and I believe there's one being done right this month. I think the notice just came out yesterday. Unfortunate timing, because we also have the employment equity survey to finish by tomorrow. So all of you go and do your employment equity survey. We need to know who's here, right? So what I will say is, there are two things we've done in hiring in faculty, which also, because it's under policy HR 10, can be done for staff as well. All our job ads now state that UBC has a strategic priority on equity and inclusion. And number two, we ask for faculty candidates to put in a statement, a diversity statement that describes how they would address that strategic priority. By doing those two things in the job ad, under the law, and we have this cleared by UBC Council as well as Employment Equity Office. Under the law, when you have two candidates that are equally ranked by merit, the one candidate that describes how they will help address UBC strategic goals on EIO, on equity and inclusion, can now be objectively ranked as a more desirable candidate. So in effect, now for all faculty hiring in science, equity and inclusion and the diversity statement is now a metric against which all candidates will be evaluated. It's because we invited it and we gave them a chance to use it. It's considered actionable. This same principle could be used in staff hiring. And I asked a colleague who's in staff, who's a representative on the community of practice, whether that was happening with staff hiring, and he said, I've never heard of it. Which is extraordinary, because the Employment Equity Act is a law that covers existing faculty and staff and future faculty and staff. So I would strongly encourage those of you in positions to influence this should be looking at how you implement this for staff hiring as well.
It's really interesting. I'm just going to switch over to another hat of yours in terms of your work as a research faculty and in COVID. Maybe just this generic question about, are you feeling optimistic about where we're at in this pandemic and where we're going, both as a university community, but probably maybe in the larger society as well? How are you personally feeling about it? And then also as an academic in this area?
I mean, I'm an optimist. That's at the core of my being. I'm also very, I'm driven by data. So in the ALDP, there's a exercise called the Strategic Deployment Inventory, where you answer 20 questions and you're pinned according to 3 groups. So blue is people-oriented, red is performance-oriented, and green are the data-driven people. I was the only person in my cohort that sat between blue and green. Nobody else was like that. And it's because I use data to inform decisions, but I'm also very cautious to leap forward. I will not rush into doing something, right? So that informs my approach on pandemic safety. So personally, I'm very conservative in how I conduct myself. I wear a mask everywhere. I will not I did this before COVID. During flu season, I won't touch a shopping cart without wiping it down with the wipes that are available. So now I do that routinely. But I'm very optimistic because we've crossed the 80% threshold for double vaccination. I'm an immunologist. I know these vaccines have exceeded our wildest dreams. Like the flu vaccine is, at its worst, is about 40% efficacious, at its best is 60% efficacious. To have 3 vaccines that exceed 68% efficacy, and the 2 major ones, the mRNA vaccines hitting 90% efficacy, we are so fortunate to have those vaccines and to be in a country where we can have not only 2 shots, but a 3rd shot coming up soon, right? In the meantime, global health equity is a concern. My parents and my sister are in India. They're lucky that they've got the AstraZeneca vaccine and are double vaccinated, but their percentage coverage is probably at 15%. And the global majority are not even singly vaccinated. That is an inequity that is going to cost us, because if the virus can escape, if the virus can mutate in non-immunized people, it will ultimately come back and hit us. And so that should be a priority. I would encourage people to think long and hard before advocating for a 3rd vaccine, because your immunity is going to be long lasting. The whole immunity is waning is really a misinterpretation of the fact that immune systems do drop, because you can't sustain your immune system at full bore for decades. Your immune system is geared to actually go into quiescence, to send memory cells into your bone marrow and to wait there until you're re-exposed, and then it responds really quickly. So what they're calling waning immunity is actually a natural process. So I'm not surprised by that, and I don't agree with a 3rd booster. I think we should be sending those shots overseas. So I'm optimistic. But in terms of the intersection of the university and how this is being handled, I think people with disability, primarily immunocompromised people, it's a hidden disability, and essentially the safety of those individuals requires that they self-disclose that, and that may not be well thought out in how we're executing this. And that's something, I'm not sure who's tasked with that role. And Sarah Jane might have the ears of the people that roll that sort of thing out.
Next question. We got one more here from the previous one. With so many critically important people in place mid-level plans, how do you support your faculty to advance the IAP, the ISP, the Wellbeing Strategic Framework, various climate and sustainability plans, and then what accountability systems do you have in place? So a real easy question there.
Oof, it's hard to do everything well at the same time. And that's why, you have to build a network within your unit. So, in my role, it'd be faculty-wide. And so my other colleagues who are associate deans who have primary responsibilities in students and HR in sustainability is a tricky one. I actually don't even know what the university's sustainability efforts are. So there you go. I've got a gap, right? But no one person can cover all of those things meaningfully faculty-wide or unit-wide. So you need to build that network, empower the people who've got the inclination and the motivation to do that, empower them not just in terms of responsibility, but also to resource them so that if they need, X, Y, Z to execute, and that's a priority, then you need to put those resources where it's needed. And then we in science have just started a community of practice where grassroots leaders, the equity and inclusion leaders, at least 2 from each unit, not just academic, they're non-academic units as well, and including staff, are now brought together at their request to form a community of practice. And that's just starting to find its feet. It's not top down, it's grassroots led. And I'm very hopeful that that community, and we have an example of that for you, that's UBC wide, which just met at 10 o'clock today, the equity action leads. It's that writ large at UBC wide. And it's incredible the energy and the initiative different people are taking, again, in things that are their favored area. And so other units can take a look at that and recognize they're actually the leaders in how do we roll out, enabling student peer-led student inclusion activity I'm going to write that name down, and then I'm going to reach out to them. One unit, psychology, talked about a Canvas site that had training for mentoring underrepresented groups. We don't have that yet, and I don't have to invent the wheel, right? So I'm very hopeful. We are at a tipping point. We said this about 6 months ago, and I'm really hopeful. I spoke to Black colleagues on CoverNet and asked them, do you share that optimism? And they said, in the past, we used to be optimistic and we always got let down. And so I'm going to be guarded about whether this is the real tipping point. But I get the sense that far more people have seen the facts and are geared towards action than ever before. And so I think the tipping point is coming, if we're not already there.
Okay, thank you. There's another question submitted upon registration, and I think you referenced a little bit about sort of the uneven playing field encountered by many of our community members who have invisible or hidden disabilities. And the question is, what could UBC's call to action for minorities with invisible learning disabilities be? As a minority, how do these actions, how does a person who faces systemic isms, what are the actions that UBC should champion and implement?
I don't have the answer for that one. And I will tell you, I've already named the person who is the thought leader on this. She's a graduate student in botany, Haley Branch, who was an intern with EIO. So to their credit, Equity and Inclusion Office has pulled together a couple of working groups. One is on sexual and gender minorities, and the other was peoples with disabilities. And the study, I've heard Haley give this talk twice. It's research driven, and it's really insightful as to the extent to which the facts of the barriers that people with hidden disabilities, hidden barriers like disabilities face, the extent to which academia is averse to anyone with disabilities and has stigmatized it. These were eye-opening for me to encounter. And so, I will defer to people who are further ahead on it than us. The bigger question of how does it get shifted, so it's a system-wide embrace. I can tell you that, an example of one thin edge of the wedge, a program that is leading us is the Canada Research Program. It was implemented by a previous federal government. And it's morphed into a targeted recruitment opportunity for faculties. So these are chairs for faculty positions. So it's a salary award given for 5, I think now it's 7 years minimum. And there's 2 levels. So junior levels at tier 2 and senior levels at tier 1. Strictly one of 4 federally recognized equity groups, right? So women, Indigenous peoples, peoples with disabilities, and racialized minorities. Hopefully the new federal government will be updating the Employment Equity Act to include the one equity group that is excluded right now, which is sexual and gender minorities. But in UBC, the CRC program has identified that people with disabilities are our biggest gap in the CRC program. And so there is a concerted effort out of the CRC office, which probably is what the EIO effort was motivated by, to document how the institution has got these barriers with respect to people with disabilities. So I think there's, again, a tipping point moment. It might not be the same as it is with IB POC faculty and staff recruitment right now, but I think it's imminent on us, and the university has repeatedly elevated that deficit. And that's something that I know all the units take seriously. I know our dean has spoken about that to our heads and directors. And the new employment equity survey, which I know someone has put, has 3 innovations, right? The one that Science was using a version of this for our faculty recruitment. We know that the way in which they asked for the census subpopulations was, we framed it as ancestry, but it's a better question now. But the different groups which you can self-identify was a far better estimate of the percentage of visible minorities. So in the first question asking, are you a visible minority? We got 24% people saying yes. But when you took the responses to the ancestry or the population subcensus questions, and we aggregated people who indicated a non-white, non-Indigenous origin, which by definition is a visible minority under Stats Canada rules, it was fully 53% of people who in the same survey who were visible minorities. So we were underestimating our percentage of visible minorities. That same principle applies to a better question on disabilities. It's a functional set of questions. So I think our estimate of people with disabilities at UBC is actually going to go up. And it's the same for people with sexual and gender minority identities. We are going to get far better assessments of what our full diversity is by filling out that survey. So take 2 or 3 minutes of your time and tell people in your units to do it. We've got to get this down. Science has only got a 30% response rate on the 22nd. So we are pushing that to our heads. We've got a gauntlet, a throwdown, a friendly competition by my predecessor, Vanessa Auld, brought it up at heads and directors to make it a friendly competition. And so the dean has risen to that and made a challenge. If we meet a minimum of 75% response rates, all units are going to get a benefit, a reward of some sort, funds to their seminar program, to their holiday party, whatever, right?
That's great. Well, thank you for the plug. I'm sure everyone is very appreciative of the plug for the Employment Equity Survey. I'm just going to go look at the Slido questions. Let's see which ones were. In your opinion, what role does it play having diversity amongst leadership? It's been always debated that the best candidates are chosen based on skills.
Yeah, so I completely reject the dichotomy of skills and minority status. We see it repeated. There's actually a study by Genevieve Fuji Johnson and Melinda Smith, who studied 5 universities, 3 at BC, including UBC, and 2 in Ontario. And the data is that you get great diversity up to the associate dean level, and then above the associate dean level, looking at deans, senior executives, and the most senior people. When you do it disaggregated, you will see that white individuals, both men and women, get through this glass ceiling, and everybody else hits that ceiling and then doesn't get recruited any further than that. And so the process by which we select deans and executives is actually done by headhunting groups, right? So the real lens should be on headhunting groups, because we know what it's taken to move the needle with respect to faculty recruitment. And I would argue that those same principles have to be applied to the headhunting groups that select those senior leadership. And I can tell you that, I've seen it myself, even within my setting, in a group that has heard my work, where inevitably when people are elevated, you get this group that is almost all white, that is not reflective of our faculty ranks, right? That happens over and over again because of one thing. It's called color blindness. People make the mistake of thinking color blindness is a virtue. All right, in some states, in France, it's state policy, right? Color blindness is a unintended, misdirected priority that elevates whiteness at the expense of everybody else, because it fails to recognize the totality of what visible minorities and other underrepresented groups might bring to the table in terms of the diversity of views and diversity of solutions that you would get. We know from the corporate world, and now we know from the early studies of academia, that diverse groups solve complex problems faster. And in the corporate world, it results in a bottom line that sees significantly higher profit margins, right? So that's a study by McKenzie et al. And so there is no question that the failure to diversify our leadership is at our own expense. And we've got to tackle why that is.
I think that is the perfect spot for us to end our hot lunch. I see we're 1 minute before our end time of 1 o'clock. I'm sure there were a lot more questions in Slido that we weren't able to get to, but just wanted to express our deep gratitude to Ninan for coming and sharing. You're a very unique bundle of experience, education, passion, commitment, and we're very lucky to have you here at UBC and to share everything with us today. So thank you so much.
My great pleasure.
And I hope you'll come back and join us for a real hot lunch at St. John's, as I think Stacey has promised. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. We have our next hot lunch, November 24th. Is that right, Stacey? And so you'll get a registration link, I think, shortly. And We're still trying to figure out whether we can do that in person or not, but we'll be able to provide you with more information in the coming weeks. So thanks again, and everybody take care, and we'll see you soon.